Its movies entertain, dazzle, and sweep us off our feet. Hollywood, it's the dream factory where fantasies are made real and the real made fantasy, to which we open our hearts and surrender our minds.
It was pure escapism.
With global blockbusters raking in the dollars and a tremendous reach and influence across the world, Hollywood has never been so powerful.
I think that American century will end, but Hollywood will continue.
It molds perceptions about culture, peoples, and even history.
Entertainment is part of our American diplomacy.
Is Hollywood the chronicle of American power?
I think you should tell history with as much drama as you can.
I am Marwan Bishara, and this is Imp. In a time when American competitiveness seems to lag, when the balance of trade is constantly in the red, there's one sector where Uncle Sam is still raking in the green.
Entertainment is one of America's biggest exports.
The top 500 grossing films of all time all come from the USA.
The gap between what we can do and what other countries can do is enormous. Yeah, that's worth cheering for.
And they bring in most of their money from overseas.
We will help make this dream of a Universal Studios project in Korea come true.
Can anyone compete?
This is Bollywood's new superhero.
Yes, there are some countries that make more movies, but nobody makes movies that make more money. Some countries block or limit the number of foreign films, limit the amount of the box office that goes to foreign producers, and give support to their film industry to protect it and help it grow.
Whether it's all of Europe or the United Kingdom or Australia, they wouldn't have industries if it wasn't for 30 to 40% government subsidies.
No, not subsidies. I wouldn't use that word. Subsidy, I think aid is a better word.
We went to France to learn how that works and discover something of what it's like to make movies somewhere that's not Hollywood. Bob Swaim is an American director who's made Paris his home. Bob, what happened to that French cinema that you grew up with, that you loved so much? Is it passé?
It's gone. I think it's gone.
But France had a movie industry, they're very proud of their movie industry. What happened to that vis-a-vis that American invasion?
First of all, I don't think France had a movie industry. We can't talk about industry when we talk about French cinema.
What would you call it?
I think it's a boutique industry. We can't talk about an industry as we have in America.
But the elephant in the room is the French government.
I think the French government is very, very important because they give aid to French film.
But what does it tell you that in France itself, where the country boasts of its cinema, those who view American films are double the viewers that see French films, on average?
There's two ways to look at it. One is that American marketing is like the best in the world. Secondly, they are masters of what they do because it is an industry and it's geared to that. I think we have to talk about what we call the cultural exception. The cultural exception is what the French and our European partners are fighting for against the Americans, because what it does, it corrects the injustice of the free market and the American dominance of world cinema.
Otherwise, it's going to be the American narrative that's going to be decisive.
Decisive because
in Europe.
Because we can't afford, films are very expensive. Who can afford to make a film today? This is why, we can criticize American cinema, But to be perfectly honest, somebody like Spielberg, with a box office hit in our movie theaters, contributes to European financing of our films. Because in France, there's a system, there's a small tax on every ticket sold that goes back into the industry.
But what is Mecca for today's world cinema?
It's always been Hollywood.
And France is what?
France is the cultural Mecca of cinema, okay?
And the difference is?
The difference is that France, people go to France, and look at my students. Why are they in France and they're not in UCLA? They're here because one is it's Paris, it's culture, it's the history of the new wave of French cinema. There is this magic, this aura of French cinema.
I'm going to talk to them later. You think they will say that they would like to work in Hollywood or in French cinema?
Well, that's a conversation I'd like to sit in on. I think that if you love film, you go where the job is. That's what we do. We have a story to tell. Who's going to give me the money? I mean, I'm very interested to see what they'd say.
Bob also is the director of the International Film and Television School. We spoke to some of his students about the power and pull of Hollywood. It seems to me that most of the movies nowadays that talk about Europe and talk about the world and talk about history and so on happen to be American movies. What are the films that you see, usually?
I watch different films. It's not, for me, it's not division. It's like, oh my God, no, I'm not gonna go to cinema because it's Hollywood film. Oh my God, I'm gonna die. It's such a bad taste. No, of course not.
There are good Hollywood movies.
Of course.
I do believe that cinema can be used as a way to express yourself against whatever you want, but then it depends what the message the director wants to say, because there's a lot of films that are the ones I'm against that just show violence and they don't leave any message. It's just violence.
I see that a lot in Asian movies, and I've heard you becoming more interested and involved in probably shooting and filmmaking in that part of the world.
Yeah, definitely, because I think Hollywood has a very interesting syndrome where they recycle a lot of stories, but basically most of them are along the same lines of a hero story. Like for example, The Last of the Mohicans. You can it's the same story as Avatar. It's the same story as Pocahontas, I guess. It's the same story as The Last Samurai. It's always one guy saving the rest of the world, or a civilization. And I think after a while, as an Asian, I'm like, I don't see the attractive part of it anymore. Well, you're gonna have the last word. You're gonna go independent, or you're gonna go mainstream?
You asked a bit earlier if the dream is to go to Hollywood. Even for me, no. My dream is to be able to make a living of my passion, which is working in cinema. And if it has to be...
What kind of living you want?
I'm fine. If I can have my camembert and my baguette, I'm fine every day. That's... If I have to work in China because there's work for me, I'll go there. It's fine.
There's no cheese in China, man.
I know, yeah, that's the problem.
Sorry.
Well, guys, girls, thank you for joining Empire. We followed the sun west to California to speak to John Hillcoat, who directed The Road, The Proposition, and Lawless, and Nikki Weinstock, a studio executive involved with such films as Bridesmaids, Get Him, To the Greek, and Pineapple Express, to talk about what happens at the intersection of art and commerce. So you know one or two things about violence. You've tackled it in your movies. There's a good and accurate portrayal. Do you get the sense that this is becoming ever more pornographic violence in Hollywood movies? See what I mean?
Perfect timing.
See what I mean?
I don't think, well, pornographic is a strong word. I see it as gratuitous, I think, is a more precise word for it. And surely there is a point where they intersect.
When you look at the diagram, you think violence is increasing in American movies, in Hollywood-type movies?
I actually think it's become more categorized now. I think in the 70s, for example, there were movies you could go because they're entertaining and they would contain unexpected violence in it. Now it's been portioned off, so there are family movies that are insistently clean, comedies that are insistently comedic, and violent movies. You know, the rise of these low-budget horror movies, for example.
In actual fact, countries like emerging countries in terms of market control, like Russia and China, have more influence than a lot of the domestic concerns.
When you talk about blockbusters, for example, we think of the first blockbuster probably as Jaws, which was 1975. When Jaws came out, it was 60 to 70% an American box office. 20 years later, Titanic came out, and that was the opposite. That was made 3 times as much internationally, and it was sort of the big part of that big shift, which now you could reliably, Hollywood studios are looking for, usually get 70% of their annual revenues overseas.
And the way I hear this, Thor is actually being was marketed overseas before it was marketed in the US, was it?
A lot of the big movies are now released in China before here.
Something like Iron Man, for example, which I know how they did, they inserted a Chinese sub-story that only aired in China. They retooled it for China.
I mean, you tackle the issue, but the presence of violence in Hollywood is on the increase over the last 2-3 decades, not on the decrease. The actual presence.
Yeah, but not in a real sense, in the sense that it's
I mean, for a child or for a teenager, what's the difference between real and not real sense?
Well, I think it's a fantasy.
Fantasy?
Yes.
Violence?
The way that in mainstream cinema, the tools and the way it's portrayed has an unreality to it.
But we were just saying that it's not just in America. Now we're exporting an entire narrative with a violent image throughout the globe, that there's an undertone of violence.
Well, I think these things go together, which is as Hollywood looks for more movies to go more places and be more global phenomena, they need it to be, I would call it spectacle, and greater spectacles.
You really don't have to understand the language, to know the language to understand those movies, because there's nothing to understand. It's just this big eye-popping event. You see these big buildings fall and you see all those things that you've never seen before and you're mesmerized by it. It's pure escapism. The pure escapism done with a lot of finesse, with a lot of money invested in it.
What is it about this culture that reaches out to this spectacular violence, but not to a feminine image of a woman? It's okay to have a woman raped non-stop in this movie and that movie, but not show her femininity and celebrate that.
I would agree with you on that. I think there are 2 very different scales, and I do think it's off-kilter. I think there is an allowance for destruction and even violence, as you say, but it isn't personal. I think sexuality is personal. I think comedy, in a lot of ways, is personal. I think there's a reason that comedies don't travel the way
it's not universal, right?
It's pretty universal.
Europe's been much more comfortable about exploring sex in the way that, and it's actually the flip side. They're very sensitive to violence in comparison, and quite open about sexuality. So it's a different cultural perspective. But this is the thing, is that the market has become, like, now even films start without even a script. It's about what the product is.
So the commercial consideration is mounting and the artistic is
diminishing, absolutely. Yeah, but there's always been a struggle with film.
There's no assurance anymore that any studio is going to make your movie unless it's Iron Man 7 or based on a best-selling book. So the risk is to compromise the art for the sake of getting through that golden gate.
So between the spectacle and the technological and the big budget, the big apocalyptic type ideas,
well,
a lot of humanistic things.
A lot of where it hit the music industry first. And this is, digital downloads and the digital revolution. I think what's happened is people have dug in their heels. They're using an old model, and the thing they can count on is what can they give an audience that they can't download, right? So they're just, 3D is one of those things. Right. The spectacle is becoming more pronounced.
You need a big screen for it,
yeah,
right?
Because, and so the bigger the spectacle, the harder it is to get that on your laptop.
But the hope lies in technology, as John said, and also the fact with technology of the immense discoverability of stuff. It used to be if the movie came to your town, you found it. Now, people can find, you know, size Korean, all Korean video, and it can become viral, and kids all over the US can watch something that they don't even know the language in which it is. That's new.
Because certainly we're not talking about universal values, we're talking about the universality of everything that constitutes danger, sex, and so on and so forth, that are just very basic instincts.
Sure, but I think television is a little faster than movies at adapting, and I think...
That's something we haven't brought up.
We haven't brought it up yet.
Yeah.
There is this great divide, but where that sort of fertile, character-driven material is being soaked up by television. There's a huge market for...
It's not techno, right, John?
And that's the beauty of television, is the limitation is you're not making something for $300 million. So it needs to be character-based.
Is there a relationship now between, especially that we're in California, between the technological companies of the West Coast and Hollywood? I mean, is there a fusion? Is there a chemistry? Is there a synergy? Is there cooperation? Is there coordination?
It's just beginning.
And he's going to the younger generation?
It's just beginning now. You would have thought there would be a marriage earlier than this, but for the most part, they've been very wary of each other. Hollywood studios are very wary of what technology can do to the traditional studio business.
You mean in terms of distribution?
In terms of distribution, absolutely. In terms of creating a whole other network of content that gets out to people that doesn't need Hollywood.
That's right.
And one of the things that we've seen a lot, I've just been watching a movie yesterday, the day before yesterday, and zapping television. And suddenly a guy who just found out that he inherited $40 billion and is going out in a helicopter to get it, suddenly he stops on their way, parks the helicopter and goes to Wendy's. And then we have Wendy cups and Wendy paper and Wendy napkins. Right. What is this? How far is this product placement going? And is there something immoral about it? Or unethical, I should say?
I think it's going to go even farther than it's gone.
Where am I?
Come with me if you want to not die.
The economics has gotten very difficult in terms of marketing a film. The cost, if you make a film for, you know, 15 million and you have to spend 30 to get it out, that's already, you know, 45, and then that keeps growing internationally.
That justifies the product placement?
I think that there have been commercial interests in movies for a long time, and this is an extreme version. I think it's dangerous. I think there are times that artistic decisions may be made as a result of the corporate interests, and then that starts to be a real compromise.
That's increasingly so because of the difficulties and budgeting?
I think so. I think because it's harder.
I mean, I have to say from my own experience that I had the opposite problem where I was doing a film called The Road, and one of the key scenes was where they find a can of Coke, but Coke actually said, you know, we couldn't even use a Coke can.
But in the gray area is where the ethics lies, and so we know that there is commercials and there's art. You know, there's commerce. So when Apple Computer is in your face, and it's actually they're selling the product, not that there's a computer to be used for whatever the plot is. It's a problem, isn't it?
Most moviegoers have a very keen sense for that, and if it's done in an inorganic, greedy way, people are going to turn off it.
The idea that we're in business, it's like the gun manufacturers, hey, you know, we're in business. But you're more than business. You're molding entire generations. You are the chronicle of history.
I think the big
you're the maker of
difference
culture.
also, there's much more of a commercial tradition here in terms of the importance of marketing and making money, and most people in Hollywood would say it's a business first. And in Europe, it's culture first. Right. And that is the big difference.
So the business first, entertainment first bit, which is, let's accept it as is. But doesn't that make the message ever more powerful and hence ever more effective, not only in America, but outside America?
But from the perspective of people trying to put together movies, you have to look at it from a practical point of view. You're going to a movie studio and you are saying, here's my vision, here's my script, here's the thing I want to do. I need $50 million of your money. I need $100 million. I need $300 million. It may be the American entrepreneur in me. It makes sense to me that a movie studio says, yeah, but we need to get Coke involved. We need to pay some of that $300 million in a commercial way. That doesn't offend me. Exactly. That doesn't offend me.
I'd say it's beyond the studios because we are at a whole new level of corporate power. The stakes are much higher. The economic divide has never been more extreme. So I think there's a lot more going on than it all just coming from the studios.
John, on this sobering note.
And a lot of the studios aren't even run by filmmakers or film people anymore. So,
thank you on that sobering note.
The issue of violence in entertainment is a persistent one. Do on-screen bullets lead to shooting in the streets? Joshua Oppenheimer has made an extraordinary documentary, The Act of Killing, about gangsters who became mass murderers employed by the army to purge Indonesia of leftists. They were great fans of American movies.
Intoxicated by the experience of whatever movie he just watched, something we can all understand if you've been to a transporting, entertaining Hollywood movie, he would sometimes dance his way across the street if he'd seen an Elvis Presley musical, he says, and kill in ways inspired by the film he'd just seen.
Sayang. Enak rupanya jadi komunis. Jangan ngangguk-ngangguk aja. Bilang benar, Pak. Ayo bilang.
Iya. Mau merokok, Pang? Ya. Coba rasakan rokoknya yang Anda sebutkan dengan neokolonialisme. Anda rasakan rasanya.
Well, if there hadn't been movies, they would still have killed. A drone pilot has the benefit of a video game-like interface that allows them to kill without feeling like they've killed. When Barack Obama, in his reported weekly meetings where he would discuss, who should be targeted with a drone attack, would have the discourse of the lesser evil, saying it's a lesser evil to kill this person than to allow this person to do what he might do if he were still alive. That probably made the act of killing for the president feel like a philosophy seminar more than killing. Similarly, I think Anwar was able to use the intoxication of his identity, the intoxicating feeling of being swept up by a great movie to help distance himself from the act of killing. So in that sense, acting was always part of the act of killing for Anwar.
We'll be back with more great directors, critics, and cinema historians.
It's just more about Hollywood's muscle, the fact that it's distributed all over, that this history is in everyone's face.
Argo and Dark 030 tell their history from an American interest point of view. It's too sanitized. America is always the good guy. My history is a horror film.
Based on a true story. Witness the greatest manhunt in history.
Most of this is true, and all of it blazes with action.
Its film is based on true stories and interweaves news footage and dramatizations with actors and actual participants. To achieve realism, no distinction is made among these elements.
Hollywood reshapes reality, and those stories become the new history. A mix of faction and fiction. Is it for the better or worse? We sat down with Oliver Stone. He won his first Academy Award for the screenplay for Midnight Express, which was, of course, based on a true story. The second for Best Director for Platoon, which also won Best Picture based on his own experience in Vietnam.
Some of your films about Nixon, Kennedy, W. Bush are problematic for some of us who deal with documents and facts and so on, because you have it both ways. If a historian is not convenient, you say you're an artist.
Now listen, I never said that. I always said I'm doing a historical drama. I'm a historical dramatist. I'm a
So you have it both ways?
I am telling a story. I never said that JFK was a documentary. I never said that.
No, you said it's myth contra myth.
I said it was a counter myth to the Warren Commission myth. I did a lot of research. I put out a book of footnotes of all what we did, but I never crossed the line and said I'm a historian.
Stone has also made a documentary about Fidel Castro and one about other Latin American leftist leaders like Hugo Chavez and Evo Morales. He's clearly a man who likes to play at the intersection of reality and fiction. And his view is that it is the official histories that are askew and that it is the historians that need some Hollywood tweaking to set the record straight.
Your films, I could see, they deal with culture, they deal with leadership, and they deal with geopolitics. But all of them, like our program, is centered around power. Apparently, you're fascinated with power, history in America.
American history is depressing because you know what? It's sanitized Disney version of history. It's like
but yours is Hollywood.
America. It's what they call a triumphalist narrative. The U.S. always wins. The U.S. is good. The U.S. cannot do no harm. We dropped the atomic bombs on Japan, as we show, for no strategic reason at all. We dropped them to scare the Russians.
But the trap here...
And because we have the bomb, that gives us the right to do what we want.
But the trap here is that Argo, Zero, Dark 30, and so on and so forth, these are films then that tell history from another narrative, also dramatic, but not accurate.
Argo and Dark 030 tell the history from an American interest point of view. That is the history version of America. That's what we get in schools. That's why kids don't study history, because it's boring. It's too sanitized. America is always the good guy.
So you
know what? My history is a horror film. It's like Saw, and I think it's much juicier. And I think my kids would prefer my history because kids like the dark side too.
So you don't think there's an essential problem in drama telling history?
Peter Kuznick and myself, he's a historian at American University. We went into the world in 2008 when Bush was in the second term. We had enough. We decided, I'm not going to do any more movies about politics. I'm going to do a documentary about my lifetime from 1940s to now. That became the untold history of the United States.
I think people around the world needs to watch these 10-part series.
I think you should tell history with as much drama as you can. I had history professors when I was young, and those who were dramatic and made it interesting, I listened. Now, I didn't know, sometimes they didn't tell me the good stuff. They were giving me misinformation. But that's up to you to figure it out and do some research. Never believe one movie, never believe one historian. Go and read about another version of it. But I'm telling you, our history is it's not the result of me. I'm not the historian, I'm a dramatist. My co-author is a real historian. He's done 30 years of this, 40 years. He has studied with all the revisionist historians. He knows that generation. So this is considered history of many different sources, people who have rewritten the Cold War.
That's the untold history you're talking about.
Yeah, but this is history that's out there. It's in college. But we have to bring it to the masses. We have to bring it to the high school level.
And you're certainly doing a good job at that.
Thank you.
Movies are more than a product, more than entertainment.
And believe it or not, entertainment is part of our American diplomacy. It's part of what makes us exceptional, part of what makes us such a world power. You can go anywhere on the planet, and you'll see a kid wearing a Madagascar t-shirt. You can say, "May the force be with you." They know what you're talking about.
What do American films tell the world about America?
I remember having an Afghan general tell me that the only thing he thought about Americans is that all the men wrestled and the women walked around in bikinis, because the only TV he ever saw was Baywatch and Worldwide Wrestling.
Probably the #1 message that runs through everything else is that when you're really in trouble, you have to call on that one person who can save the world.
It's Superman!
And he happens to be an American, at least a naturalized immigrant.
Q 007.
All right, sometimes he's British. Sometimes he's in a world that doesn't exactly include America. He might not even be human.
This is me.
But he always sure seems American. As for not quite Western people, not much has changed since Gunga Din. The anti-colonial leader is an evil madman.
أمامنا والبار من وراءنا.
The good ones are eager to abandon their heathen ways to become adorable little mascots.
You're looking very regimental, Dean.
Thank you, Sergeant.
Short round. Step on it.
Okie dokie, Dr. Jones. Hold on to your potatoes.
When they act, all they can create is destruction. All they achieve is failure. We brought together a group of very close observers of the peculiar culture that is Hollywood to discuss how much of an effect movies have on the realities of hard and soft power. Tim Grierson is vice president of the Los Angeles Film Critics Association. Priya Jaikumar teaches at the University of Southern California and is author of Cinema at the End of Empire, Politics of Transition in Britain and India. Ed Rampel is a film historian and reviewer and the author of Progressive Hollywood, a People's Film History of the United States. And last but not least, Palestinian filmmaker Hani Abu Assad, director of Paradise Now, and whose latest film, Omar, has been nominated for an Oscar.
Tim, Priya, Ed, and Hani, welcome to Empire. In my conversation with Oliver Stone, he seemed to not take kindly to the idea that he has it both ways, he and his fellow movie makers, that they can be dramatists and historians at the same time.
Well, I think someone like Oliver Stone, you know, he is somebody who is actively trying to, not necessarily rewrite history, but he is trying to inform our memory of history.
I guess, and I would also add that, you know, there's people like Oliver Stone who are consciously rewriting history, and then there's Hollywood films that are just indexes of their time. So if you look at kind of the Reagan-era films, Lethal Weapon, Rambo, it already embedded within that are notions of what is going on in the nation, this kind of masculine, you know, do-it-yourself, one man against the world kind of image, Americans against the drugs, Americans against the Sandinistas, Americans against communists. So I think history, all films are dramatizations of histories, either of their time or self-conscious, self-reflexive dramatization.
Is it okay for an entire new generation of Americans and new young people around the world to know history from a dramatic, not accurate version of it?
But I agree. I think everybody do that, even in the past history. I truly believe, like when the Jewish priest wrote the Bible, you know, they took just mythologies from all other nations and they just rewrote their own invented histories, not even
So
history.
it's okay to take liberty with history?
Yeah, sure.
Reinvent, reinterpret?
Well, I think historians are taking liberties with history. They're writing a certain history based on arguments, sure, but films are doing it. It's just more about Hollywood's muscle, you know, the fact that it's distributed all over, that this history is in everyone's face.
So it's not just the rewriting of history as if it's an artistic self-interpretation of something, that there is an aspect that it's a reflection of American power, and hence embodied in the new narration.
Well, I think that's true, because I think part of it's also giving an audience what Hollywood assumes it wants.
It's quite paradoxical that when America is kind of losing wars, or not exactly, you know, popular around the world, in Hollywood, America is winning wars, and it's quite popular around the world.
Well, look at Black Hawk Down. What's the one thing that everybody who was watching CNN at the time remembers about that actual real-life incident?
In Somalia.
Was about the dead U.S. servicemen being dragged through the dirt in the dust in their underwear by the triumphant Somalis. Where is that in the movie Black Hawk Down, which was heavily supported by the military?
Clearly, the dominant narrative, the dominant movie watching today, even in the garrison of filmmaking like France, is American. You notice that? I mean,
absolutely.
In Middle East, Jerusalem, it's American filmmaking.
Actually, because they won, and they won because they didn't forget what is the main goal of the movie, and which is entertaining. And the Europeans took European filmmakers in the 60s especially, took a distance between them and their people. They said, we are not here to entertain, we have to disturb. They felt like, well, no, we are not, like, why should I entertain the common people? You know, it's not my job. It's not my job to dramatize it. I have to invent a new language to them, and they lost it.
Can I disagree with that?
Of course.
I think that it's true. I mean, I find Hollywood films very entertaining. You know, I think they're great. But if you don't have the kind of distribution muscle, which U.S. got after the Second World War, with the Marshall Plan, rebuilding of Europe, you know, they flushed them back with Hollywood films in West Germany, in Japan. When all of Europe was decimated, basically the U.S. controlled the distribution network.
The only place they didn't win is actually India. Not really. Yes, still the Indian movie is very strong in India. And why? The Indians really didn't forget. At first, you have to entertain. And then you bring your ideas, you know, whether it's an American Dream movie or the
But Indian government did not allow U.S. films to come in. There was import substitution.
The questions of race, the questions of gender, the question of social justice, a lot of these things came first in Hollywood, then in America, and perhaps in the rest of the world. There's something about having a black president on TV and through Hollywood that paves the way for an American president to become really an American president.
Well, there's a lot of conversation when you have people like Morgan Freeman as president in a disaster movie, admittedly, but the idea of actually putting that idea in Americans' faces, and Americans' ideas of this could actually be not a white person who's president of the United States. I mean, it was joked about a lot at the time, but that does, in a very kind of subtle way, open the door to the idea that change can happen.
There's a selling of this, liberalism, if you will, individual liberty, freedom, and so on and so forth, and fairness. But it's also selling in a spectacle, a certain sort of capitalism, sort of greed.
Sure.
And throughout the world.
So, that's absolutely true, but we should not look at Hollywood as being monolithic. And there are different trends in Hollywood. The producers, the studios, the suits, the executives, they may be mostly interested in the bottom line. A lot of artists are socially aware, socially conscious people. And to be an actor, I'm not an actor, but to be an actor requires, I believe, empathy as a characteristic in order to get inside somebody else's, to walk that mile in somebody else's moccasins.
The main issue in movies is actually drama or entertaining. And with this, if you lose that, you can't get anywhere, because most of people want to see a form of dramatized version of reality in order to accept it.
I think Haney's movies are a good example of that. Both of those movies are, in a certain way, certain recognizable genres of films that audiences around the world recognize. They're thrillers, they're romances, they're love stories, but there are messages and issues at play. And I'm curious for you as a filmmaker, do you think first about the ideas that you want to talk about in your film, or do you think about a certain type of genre?
Sure, I mean, not the genre. I think it's the emotional involvement is the main issue through drama. And you can put this drama in a genre, a love story or a thriller or a comedy, but at the end it's the structure of emotional involvement with your characters.
Don't you think that there's a certain standardization now?
I mean, when you think about a movie like Mandela, for instance, that came out last year, I think in some ways it's commendable. It's an idea of creating a universality that no matter where we live on the planet, there are certain humanistic themes that we all share. Hollywood is telling stories of other lands, other worlds, in a conventional narrative that essentially...
Conventional narrative or an American narrative?
Yeah. I would say an American narrative. It's very much the idea that a person comes from nothing, rises to become a success and changes the world. Against all odds and changes the world. Now, in some ways, that's laudable because it shows that no matter where you are, that narrative applies. But I think the downside, too, is what we do is we create for, just speaking for an American audience, the idea that other worlds are not worth investigating because they're just like ours.
I don't agree with the idea of a universal narrative. I feel like there are universal experiences, life, death, sex, love, hate, but the encounter of that is very different. And it is on the backs of empire that stories become universal. Shakespeare's read everywhere. He's a wonderful playwright, but maybe Ghalib or Faiz would be read everywhere if people spoke Urdu. But I think that American century will end, but Hollywood will continue, because Hollywoodization doesn't necessarily, to me, mean Americanization. It means a certain kind of savviness to the market, you know, like the blockbuster kind of mode, which is you saturate the theaters.
But do you agree that there is a standardization and homogenization of the storytelling aspect around the world now, from America out?
No, if you study narrative, it's all structured from back into the Greeks. You know, you have really, if you study structure of narrative, is you have, you know, the bad and the good, and you have the conflict, and you have the 8 steps toward the climax and all this. Like if you study narrative from the Greeks till now, nothing changed.
You have to have passion, logic, and facts.
Yes.
And also in terms of the false narrative, you mentioned earlier George W. Bush, John Wayne, and Rambo. Now, Sylvester Stallone, Bush, and John Wayne never, ever served in the military. Ronald Reagan was in the military, never, ever saw combat. And so it's this false narrative, and of course, their films get major support from the Pentagon when they're made, whereas when Oliver Stone, a decorated Vietnam War veteran, tries to make films that present a counter-narrative, another point of view, this Vietnam veteran who knows the truth about war and what really happens, he doesn't get a cent from the Pentagon. No support.
But I want to add about Hollywood one thing, because I'm working with them and I think they are not doing this consciously. Like there is no a conspiracy where they are sitting and saying, well, how can we promote America? It's really about greed and money. And they're telling you, like at the end, why they are telling the stories of the world, because they see a market in it. And there is nobody else can do these kind of movies. It's expensive. They are doing it.
But Tim, from Hani's last point about there is no conspiracy, and probably we all agree there's not. But isn't it the very strength of Hollywood is the fact that it is not a conspiracy? There is no state-centered, guided policy for Hollywood. It's the fact it acts freely.
I have to disagree.
Right, I mean, a movie like Argo that has factual inaccuracies is, if you put those aside, a very well-told, fun story. You just have to not think about the actual facts. And also, I think part of the reason why it won Best Picture last year at the Oscars is to use that specific audience, the membership of the Academy, that tells them something that makes them feel good about themselves, that the movies can help change the world in a very small way. I think what happens is that a lot of times, audiences like those stories. Audiences want those stories.
But you notice what you're saying, and help us here, Priya, that somehow justice is done when, in Zero Dark 30, when you kill the villain, Bin Laden. In Argo, when you save the hostages. In Captain Phillips, when you take care of the Somalis. Justice is done is always when there's a white guy standing on the thing and making sure.
You know, I mean, these films will get their revenues back because domestically they manage and they will have an international audience. But if you have someone watching that from Afghanistan or wherever else, you know, who have lived through the 80s when the US and UK were supporting the Mujahideens, but, you know, suddenly in the 2000s, the Mujahideen, once they Islamicize, are the bad guys, then Idris Elba saying today we're canceling the apocalypse they're going to roll their eyes. Like, this is not America, the savior. So there's people all over who are processing things in different ways because they've encountered history in a different ways. But I think where America did win the war is defining a certain kind of cool. I mean, that same Mujahideen might be wearing Levi's jeans and, you know, the latest Tom Cruise jacket from Mission Impossible, something.
And eating at McDonald's or something.
Exactly.
It's quite paradoxical.
I think the conspiracy is, and not in the conspiracy kind of way, but the conspiracy is capitalism. I mean, free market won out. And
that's
so
exactly right. Slumdog is all about capitalism.
Exactly. That's why it's quite obvious.
Winning a lottery.
Isn't that a statement in favor of Hollywood when there is an Americanization of anti-Americanism around the world?
It's another form of control.
It's certainly influence.
Yeah. Controlling what he's called as a Palestinian. As we were talking earlier, no, you're an Arab Israeli, or are you a Palestinian? What's in a name? They want to control everything.
There was a poll done by the Reader Digest, and they found out that the 4 out of the most 10 trusted people in America are actors.
Right.
I think that's quite paradoxical. You have to be a performer to be one of the most... And this guy...
Tom Hanks?
Is one of them.
Yeah.
You actually become one of the most trusted faces in America. What you're saying is that virtual world and the real world get mixed up.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
But that's exactly where the danger of this influence of Hollywood.
If you think about some of the things, let's say George W. Bush said.
There's an old poster out west. that said wanted, dead or alive.
This is a certain kind of very straight Western. So yes, those kind of images and words authorize certain kinds of behaviors. I mean, those myths are dangerous myths because the world is not going in that direction. It's going in polarization between the rich and the poor. But that dream has been sold to the world. That has been successful. So it's like, you know, America is dead, long live Hollywood.
On this very insightful note, Priya, Tim, Ed, Hani, thank you for joining Empire. And I'll be back with a final thought. Actually, I'll be outsourcing my final thought to my friend and colleague, Empire's very own, Larry Barnard, the author of a number of books. One in particular, American Hero, became one and probably a lot of people's favorite movie, Wag the Dog. Larry.
I'm fascinated by the intersection of Hollywood and reality. Take a look at the first Gulf War. It looked so much like a made-for-TV movie, I said, there's got to be a producer or a director doing this.
You want me to produce your war?
The producer in the movie has to figure out why the United States would go to war with a pipsqueak little country.
We just found out they have the bomb. That's good.
10 years later, George Bush faces the same problem.
The British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa.
The producer still faces a problem. The pipsqueak little country does not have the means to get the bomb to the United States.
They'd have to have a rocket in that shit, right? And they are a bunch of wogs. No, cross out. All right, so it's a suitcase bomb. I didn't even know I said that. It's a suitcase bomb. You don't need missiles. You can put a bomb in a suitcase, right?
Once again, we return to reality, and there's the same solution. Now, the peculiarity is nobody laughs George Bush off the podium. They all accept what he says, and the next thing you know, we're off to war.
They could provide these arms to terrorists, giving them the means to match their hatred.
And my very final thought is, if you're at home, you think you're watching the news, you could be watching a Hollywood movie. And that's the way it goes.
That's right, that's the way it goes. And follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Until next time.